Well, thank you very, very much. Larry, thank you. Sometimes the introductions are going to be longer than your remarks, and that got precariously close to that this afternoon. But I'm delighted to be on the campus of George Washington University and to participate in this very worthwhile forum and discussion. I regret I wasn't here beginning this morning to be sitting in the back of the room to sort of, I guess, like Tom Sawyer, you could be a witness to your own eulogies or autopsy or whatever the comments may have been along the way. And so I gather I can get at least a debrief as to some of the observations that were made about the legislation. And I don't say that lightly. It's very, very important. I think conferences like this are tremendously valuable. And going back over, there's nothing more dangerous than a member of Congress who has written a piece of legislation and considers he's crafted perfection. And given the length of this particular undertaking and the number of issues it touches upon, I'd be the last person to suggest that was the case in this bill. And so having conferences to talk about the practicalities, how it works, how it's not working, and in fact, my hope is, and we discussed this briefly at lunch, that this new Congress coming in, and given the political realities of the new Congress, this might be well advised to be a Congress of oversight, in a sense. Probably not likely to legislate a lot, given the divisions that exist. But if they were to take the time to go back now and look at the actions taken by the previous Congress in major areas such as health care and this particular bill, I think would be a tremendous contribution to the American public in that process. I'd be remiss if I didn't perform the essential political obligation of connecting with the institution you're in front of. And so I'm delighted to be at the school where my brother earned both his master's and his PhD. And I say that and then migrated to Georgetown, where he's taught for the last 35 or 40 years. But pleasant to be back here. Steve Trachtenberg, your former president, was a great personal friend. He was the former president of the University of Hartford in Connecticut and knew him well during those years, and obviously when here at George Washington as well. I was struck by the title of the conference, The Shape of Things to Come, the Financial Regulatory Landscape in the Post-Dodd-Frank Era. I don't mind that title. Barney Frank might take exception to being talked about. Barney still thinks he's valuable and viable in the financial regulatory services area. But again, I'm delighted to be asked to come here. I was struck, and Larry, again, your introduction was very, very generous. One of my favorite introductions ever given of a person in public life was given many, many years ago at a black-tie dinner at the Waldorf Astoria. The honoree was William Howard Taft, former, in fact, the only person ever to achieve the stature of being a president and a chief justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he was being honored for his public service to the country at this very distinguished dinner. The master of ceremonies was the United States Senator from New York at the time, a fellow by the name of Chauncey Depew. Give you an idea how the world has changed. Chauncey was not only the senator from New York, but simultaneously the president of the New York Central Railroad. No conflict there, I'm sure, at all, as he went through and legislating his way along. Anyway, he went on at some length. He thought of himself, I think, as sort of a gadfly and a quick wit, and so he wanted to have some fun, I think, at Taft's expense. And you may recall from photographs of Taft that he was huge. Not only a giant, what he achieved, but physically was about 6'6", 6'7", weighed about 400 pounds, just a giant of a guy. And anyway, Chauncey goes on with this introduction to the black-tie dinner and finally concludes it by saying, "It now gives me a great deal of pleasure to present to you a man who is both pregnant with integrity and pregnant with courage." Well, of course, the crowd roared its approval. They gave Taft a standing ovation. Taft slowly made his way up to the podium, waited for the noise to subside and the crowd to become reseated. And then he turned to it and he said, "If it is a girl, I shall call her integrity." And he said, "If it is a boy, I shall call him courage. But if, as I suspect, it's nothing more than gas, I shall call it Chauncey Depew." And all this. So when I hear those wonderful introductions, Larry, I couldn't help but think of old Chauncey here in that introduction of Taft. Well, let me do this. I'm going to share some thoughts with you. And obviously, look, taking 20 or 25 minutes here, which I'll try and do, and talk about sort of what went on. I became chairman of the Banking Committee in January of 2007. I've been on the committee under different chairs going back to Bill Proxmire when I arrived in the Senate, put on the Banking Committee. I arrived on the Banking Committee to show the world not dissimilar to what's occurred in the elections last fall. I arrived in 1980, in January 81, with 16 new Republicans. And Alan Dixon and I were the only two Democrats elected in the Reagan landslide of that year. And Alan and I, there were 3 committee assignments after all else had been picked over by the more senior members. And there were 2 seats on the Banking Committee, 1 on agriculture and 1 on foreign relations. And so obviously Dixon coming from Illinois, agriculture made sense. I was put on foreign relations, and both of us ended up with seats on banking. And for the next 30 years, it's not a meritocracy, as you all know, the United States Congress. You migrate based on death and departure of your colleagues along the way. And so eventually arrived in January of 07 as the chair of the committee with the change in the 06 elections as well, following Paul Sarbanes. I was telling Larry as we were coming in, I'll never forget Paul Sarbanes putting his right arm around my shoulder in the Banking Committee one day in a particularly hectic, chaotic hearing that was going on in the late fall of 2006. And with his left arm, he sort of swept it across the room and then whispered into my ear and said, just think, in a couple of months, all of this is yours. And little did I know how prophetic that would be as we took over in 07 and began with hearings very early on, the first week in February, on the residential mortgage crisis. And then over the next 7 or 8, 10, 12 months, we had about 75, 80 hearings on the subject matter, formal and otherwise, trying to develop some attention. In fact, to their credit, Jack Reed and Jim Bunning, under Republican leadership of the committee, had held hearings on the mortgage crisis in 06. And I think if 4 people showed up to hear what was going on, it would have been a lot in the room. And a lot of other people. At the Federal Reserve staff, we talked about this earlier, we're doing a lot of work in identifying the problems much earlier than that. So the backdrop begins, for me at any rate, in 07 as the chair of the committee. And so I thought what I'd try and do is go through and give you some idea of what went on during that period, how the law developed, what our goals were and intentions were with legislation, and then try to open up some questions and comments you may have yourself if time permits. So I, again, thank all of you for being a part of this program today. So over 36 years, I've been involved, as Larry generously pointed out, in many, many legislative efforts, and some of them could actually qualify as landmark legislation. But few of them have been as complicated or as detailed as the financial reform legislation. Today, what I would like to do is to give you an idea of what the mood was like in 2007, the events of 2008 leading up to the 14 days in September of 2008, and the efforts to write a comprehensive financial reform bill during the first 2 years of the Obama administration. I became chairman, as I pointed out, of the Banking Committee in January of 07. At that time, even though there hadn't been comprehensive financial reform since the 1930s, policymakers were largely uninterested in the subject matter and taking the long overdue look at the architecture of our financial system. In fact, despite earlier warnings of signs of a financial system in trouble, the mantra from Wall Street and the financial services sector was a call, in fact, in January of 07 for even further deregulation and the threat that the financial centers would be moving out of our country to Great Britain or other places. After all, people were making money, and what better proof of the soundness and the safety of a system than that? And if deregulation had produced this much wealth and success, wouldn't further deregulation provide even more of the same? But even then, as the economy reached new heights, there were serious cracks appearing in the foundation. During the calendar year of 2007, as Banking Committee Chair, as I mentioned again a moment ago, I held over 75 hearings, meetings, formal and otherwise, on the residential mortgage crisis. In fact, the second hearing that I held in early February of 2007 was on the mortgage crisis itself. And despite repeated efforts, I say politely, the Bush administration refused to accept or even acknowledge, in my view, the seriousness of the situation throughout all of that calendar year. It took the cascading events of 2008 to finally bring some action. The collapse of Bear Stearns on March 16th of 2008 was a warning that too many ignored. J.P. Morgan, of course, picked up Bear in a fire sale, making a killing in the process, and the sense was that any crisis had been averted. Then 6 months later, the financial giants, Lehman Brothers and AIG, collapsed. And on the night of September 18th, I found myself in the most extraordinary meeting with Hank Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, Ben Bernanke, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and about 12 of my colleagues from the House and the Senate in the conference room with the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Just to put it mildly to you, without exaggeration, hyperbole, what was said in that room that evening, I sort of equate with the political equivalency, if you will, or the economic equivalency of almost a 9/11 moment. All of the oxygen left the room. In a very low, tempered, measured voice, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve announced to us in that room that unless, and I'll quote him for you, unless we acted within a matter of days, the entire financial system of the United States and a good part of the world could melt down. Needless to say, there was dead silence. It may have been only 30 seconds or a minute. It seemed like an hour in the room as people held their breath. Again, this was not a speech for some large audience to try to motivate people, but merely to give us a clear understanding of how serious the moment was. The events over the next 14 days were catastrophic, and less than 48 hours later, less than 2 days later, the Secretary of the Treasury sent me a 3-page bill, and not a memo, a bill, legislatively crafted language, asking for $700 billion in taxpayer funds, no details, no oversight, no judicial review, and no strings attached. We did the best that we could over the coming days to put something together, a more workable solution, but the public furor was inevitable, equaled if not exceeded the town hall meetings that you saw in August of 2008. And justifiable, I might add, that anger. The American people had worked hard to build their own economic security. They hadn't created this mess, and yet they were being asked to pay to clean up this very set of problems. Now, let me say this. Some of my colleagues in the Congress, good public servants of both parties, lost their jobs in the United States Congress because they supported the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act in that fall of '08. I firmly believe that they did what the founding fathers of our country absolutely intended at moments like that. They acted in the best interests of our country, and I believe that's what the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act did. It saved the country, and had we not acted, I believe firmly, and will go to my grave believing, that had we not taken the steps we did, our country would look very different today than it does, with all of its present problems, had we not taken the action in the fall of '08. For years, we've been driving full speed ahead down a path leading straight off the cliff, in my view. In September of '08, we came dangerously close to the edge of that precipice. And although the actions we took to prevent the complete crash and burn of our financial system were highly criticized and unpopular with many, I firmly believe that they were the right thing to do, and indeed the only steps to be taken at that time. In retrospect, of course, much of that criticism was extreme and premature. This piece of legislation achieved its goals, in my view. The TARP program has been successful and glaringly less expensive than many predicted it would be. And as we all know now, the economic storm that blew through 2008 was not just the normal ebb and flow of an of a cyclical economy. Wall Street had become the Wild West in many ways. Cowboys in the financial services industry were running wild, in my view, and the sheriffs in town, our regulators, were unable, and mostly unwilling to rein in this risky behavior. Because of Wall Street's abuses and irresponsibility, small businesses on Main Street suffered. Capital markets froze almost overnight. Small businesses with unblemished credit histories couldn't place orders and could barely meet their own payrolls. Many Americans saw their wealth disappear and stopped, of course, making purchases. We experienced and continue to see record foreclosures, and unemployment skyrocketed and still remains much too high. It is now clear that our financial system was broken and it needed to be fixed. And that solution, it was critical, in my view, to strike a balance where we would continue to foster creativity and innovation in the financial services sector, and yet simultaneously rein in risk and restore confidence in the stability of our financial markets. In my view, the central ingredient to economic stability and growth is confidence. If investors, entrepreneurs, and consumers don't have faith in the fundamental stability of the American economy, if they lack confidence in the soundness of our financial institutions and the fairness of that system, then what happened in 2008 and 2009 will, I would predict with absolute certainty, occur again. And then we won't grow, won't prosper, obviously, and American global leadership in this area will suffer. Therefore, the need for serious financial reform seemed clear. My job was not to punish those who created the mess, although I believe that some punishment was warranted. My job, our job in the Congress, Barney's and mine and others who worked with us, was to try and reform the architecture that was almost 100 years old, to build a system that would help avoid economic crises when possible, and to minimize them when they occur, as they most assuredly will. As we began to reform the process, a process that ended up taking nearly 2 years, I was guided by three main goals. First, I knew that we needed a regulatory structure that reflected the reality of the 21st century. Much of the framework governing our financial system was drawn up nearly a century ago by people who never imagined the creation of computer systems that simultaneously trade thousands of shares in a single second, or the rise of global markets and banks with trillion-dollar balance sheets. Financial regulation had simply failed to keep pace, in my view, with the innovations in the industry. Not just the technical changes, but also the creative innovation designed to be outside the financial regulatory framework. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that in the rush to regulate, we did not strangle the source of so much wealth creation and job creation in our country and elsewhere. Financial services are critically important for our domestic economies, as well as our leadership around the world. So maintaining that balance had to be a top priority as well. There's a statue outside the Federal Trade Commission. Again, for those who I had lunch with, I've told this story, but I repeat it here again. Those of you who drive down Constitution Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue in this town come to that intersection where the Federal Trade Commission is. And there is that statuary. Sort of looks like something created in an early Stalin era of a large horse and a man grappling as to who is going to control. It depicts the muscular stallion being held back by an equally strong individual. And looking at the statue, and you wonder who's winning, and it's not clear who is, the horse or the individual. I've often thought of that image, and did so many times during the 2 years of this negotiation of what this bill would look like. It reflected, in my view, as it does so much of what we tried to do with the financial reform bill. We want a robust financial services sector that is creative, innovative, driving growth, and powering the economy. But at the same time, we want to make sure that that horse doesn't run away from us, doesn't run wild. That tension, that back and forth between regulation and industry must always exist, and it's never going to be perfectly in balance. But it is that sense of balance we try to achieve, I believe, or should be our goals. What was happening, of course, in my view, long before 2007, was that the horse was out of control. There were those who refused to use the controls at their disposal, and new controls were obviously needed as well. To state the obvious, we're living in a global economy, and our markets, obviously, are more interconnected than ever before. And as we've painfully seen, a financial problem in one nation can reach around the world in a matter of days or even seconds. So thirdly, the creating of new rules. I wanted to encourage international harmonization. Otherwise, I knew we could end up with sovereign arbitrage, in a sense, much as it was in January of '07, when people were threatening that they would leave here to go elsewhere with their financial services industry. And if you don't deregulate here, as I said earlier, we'll end up somewhere else. Of course, I discovered that that same argument was being made in London and elsewhere, and that if they didn't deregulate, people would be moving to New York, back and forth. So the need for consistent international standards, it seemed to me, was clear. And without international cooperation, we risk having a race, a regulatory race to the bottom, something Arthur Burns used to talk about years and years ago. Now, again, I'll just say as an aside to here that one, I think leading was very important. I think the United States, acting earlier than anyone else, has in a sense set a template. Doesn't mean everyone's going to necessarily follow us exactly what happens, but we've maintained our leadership, I think, by doing this. Whatever else you may think about the details of the bill, this template is becoming a basis upon which other nations are considering their own regulatory reform structure. The best evidence I can give you of that is that I asked my senior staff after the passage of the legislation to go to London and Brussels, Paris, and Madrid, and to meet with their counterparts in the European Union to get a sense of how they were reacting to what we had just done. And again, without overstating the case, they were warmly welcomed. And in fact, the European Union, on the derivatives section, on the area of consumer protection, as well as in the area of oversight, the idea that we try with the Oversight Council, are following very much the examples that we created in our own legislation. So there's some good news that there seems to be that harmonization that we're seeking as well. So keeping with those goals in mind, I set out to do 4 major things in the bill. There's a lot in the bill, obviously, but there were 4 major pieces that we tried to craft in all of this. One was to end too big to fail. Again, never again should we allow either an implicit or explicit guarantee that the federal government would bail out a financial institution merely because it had become too large. This was the one issue upon which Democrats and Republicans seemed to have common interest and common cause. There was a lot of other debate about various other parts of this bill, but on this one, there was a great sense of commonality. And in fact, the bill never would have passed, never would have gotten off the ground, had we not reached some agreement on the too-big-to-fail provisions. And I want to particularly thank Mark Warner, Bob Corker, who did all the work primarily. I divided up the labor of the committee into groups so that there would be people involved in various sections of the legislation rather than trying to write something between a chairman and a ranking member. It was far too complicated to leave in the hands of just one or two people and their staffs. And I asked Mark and Bob Corker to take on this issue, and they spent a lot of time at it, just as I did with Judd Gregg and Jack Reed to take on the derivatives area, Chuck Schumer and Mike Crapo to deal with governance questions and the like, and Dick Shelby and I wrestled with Consumer Protection Bureau and other related matters, but to try and divide up that labor so that we could end up with people vested in the process, committed to it, and bring at least the opportunity for a bipartisan solution in the end. So with that in mind, these four goals, the first thing that we wanted to do was to deal with too big to fail. Today, taxpayers, investors, and creditors, and executives alike know with some certainty that if a company puts itself in a position to fail, fail is exactly what will occur. De jure, for those lawyers in the room, we believe that we've achieved this statutorily with the bill. But lest there be any doubt, de facto, it'll be a very brisk day in Dante's Inferno when any Congress would ever allow a bailout to occur again. Secondly, we are interested in transparency and accountability in our markets, bringing the $600 trillion and the over-the-counter derivatives market out of the shadows and into the open. Third, we established an early warning system with the Financial Stability Oversight Council and the new Office of Financial Research at its centerpiece. So we will not have to learn what a financial institution, product, or practice is unsafe only after it has already undermined the stability of our economy. And lastly, we established an independent Consumer Financial Protection Agency, maybe the most controversial piece of the whole bill, ironically, in a way, considering the implication of the derivatives section, the whole area of proprietary trading and the like, which attracted a lot of attention, obviously, from various sectors. But this particular piece was the one politically that was a threat to the bill at all. And so to provide the American public with a clear and accurate information they need to make in order to make good financial decisions, as well as with the security that comes with knowing that someone is watching out for their interests and their interests alone. Failure to protect consumers can wreak havoc on the financial system, as we've learned. Bad loans drove individual borrowers into bankruptcy, but they also drove some of our largest financial institutions to the brink of collapse. That led to millions of foreclosures, as we know, cast a blight across countless neighborhoods, caused the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the evaporation of hundreds of billions of dollars, perhaps trillions of dollars from the investment accounts of Americans from all walks of life. As I stated at the outset of these remarks, financial reform was not about punishing the financial services industry. That was not my job or the job of the Banking Committee. Rather, it was about restoring order, stability, and most of all, confidence in our financial system. Americans lost millions of jobs, trillions of dollars in wealth, but they also lost something far more serious and far more dangerous, in my view. They lost their faith in our markets, their faith that regulators could be trusted to do their jobs, and their confidence that the economy is a place where success does come from hardworking people who play by the rules. Those who think that protecting and empowering consumers is a hindrance to economic growth simply do not understand that our economy so depends so critically on the confidence of those who engage in basic financial activities on a daily basis. If ordinary Americans don't feel that they can make good decisions about their family's finances, decisions based on clear and accurate information, or if they must constantly worry that they'll be ripped off every time they take out a loan, make a credit card purchase, make an investment, or even open a bank account, then how in the world can we expect them to generate the activity that we all understand needs to power our economy out of this recession? The abusive practices and shadowy, arcane financial products that contributed to this crisis undermined that vital confidence, in my view. What we did in Dodd-Frank was take the existing authority that was currently scattered throughout the alphabet soup of safety and soundness regulators and consolidated into one focused and effective Consumer Bureau. There are those, of course, there are, of course, many other provisions I mentioned at the outset in this bill, but these were the four major critical points that we tried to achieve. And while not the subject of this conference, there was another critical goal that I was determined to achieve in this legislative process, and that was the ability of the Congress to craft a comprehensive piece of legislation free from acrimony, that was inclusive and written in a place where the American public could witness it all. Barney Frank, my colleagues in the House and the Senate, Democrats, Republicans alike, engaged in that very open process. Juxtapose that, if you will, with the health care legislation passed in the same Congress. And while it may not seem terribly important to you in a very acrimonious environment, it was important to me to demonstrate that 535 people, working with an administration, stakeholders, and others, could actually sit down and work its way through a piece of legislation as difficult and as complicated as this. But the work is obviously not complete. Congress established a framework and a clear path forward. The rest, obviously, is up to regulators. And while I'm pleased to report that the process of implementing the Wall Street Reform Bill is moving swiftly and efficiently, the regulators are making progress every day, faster than many thought they would, promulgating rules and taking their deadlines very seriously. Of course, Congress still has the responsibility to hold regular oversight hearings to keep the regulators on their toes. In my experience, the knowledge that you'll be called to testify with some frequency before a congressional committee has a sort of an interesting way of getting people's attention and motivating people to stay on top of their game. In this new Congress, I believe it will be important to preserve the integrity of this law and not to repeal it, its key parts of it, as some have threatened, and to preserve the confidence that large majorities of the American people have expressed in these reforms, and the certainty that the financial sector needs to have within that sector, and they've sought for so long. Today, you in this conference have discussed a great deal about the new rules and regulations, but the financial crisis was not just a failure of regulations and rules. It was also a failure of responsibility. Too many people put short-term profits over long-term stability. Too many people obeyed the letter of the law while taking advantage of the loopholes to game the system. No system of rules will ever be perfect, obviously, and laws alone can never prevent every problem. You cannot legislate wisdom, and you can't legislate morality, as we've all learned. But what we can do, and what we have done, I think, in this bill, or tried to do, is to build safeguards for the American people so that they do know that they won't be taken advantage of or to see our country's economy collapse around them again. Before we passed the Dodd-Frank Act, our financial system allowed banks to gamble with taxpayer money. That allowed dangers to grow to a colossal size in our nation, which too often failed to protect ordinary Americans from predatory lenders. And although much of the financial reform law now rests with the regulators for implementation, it successfully addresses the problems, areas that I think left our nation vulnerable to the financial crisis in the first place, and provides, I also believe, the regulatory infrastructure for dealing with the new problems of the future. And with that, I thank George Washington University for the generous invitation to be with you, and I thank all of you for your involvement as well. Thank you all very much. Thank you, ladies. Yeah. And now some questions or comments, if you've got still time. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, sir.
You all understand that Mark Gross from the Pomerantz Law Firm, we all understand that the process of making legislation is a process of compromise. And if you had to, your druthers, is there a particular provision that you would have liked to have been in there that was not?
Well, yeah, there's always that case. I appreciate you making that point. As you may, some of you who followed this in great detail may know that in November of 2008, I offered my version of a discussion draft of the bill. It was not met warmly by everybody involved, but I thought it was a good place to start a discussion, a debate about what ought to be involved. I would have had a little more consolidation of the prudential regulators. The Office of Thrift Supervision is gone in the bill, and not an easy thing for any Congress to eliminate something they've created over the years. But I frankly would have preferred even more consolidation than is the case. with the Federal Reserve, and this was a debate back and forth. And again, I want to emphasize the point here. So many times I had people come to the door as we tried to keep that door always open. The door was never closed to anybody to come and make their case. But people would walk in the door and say, you know, we didn't create this mess. Why are we involved in this bill? And what I kept on saying over and over again, the bill isn't about, it's not my job to sit there as the chairman of a committee to write a bill merely to punish people for past behavior. I was trying to create something that made some sense going forward. And again, not that I felt that maybe some people shouldn't have been punished in some way, but going forward. And so looking at the Federal Reserve structure itself, it's been a long time since there's been any real analysis of it. We did some things on the election of regional bank presidents and so forth, eliminating the Class A directors from having a choice in that matter, which I'm sure wasn't met terribly warmly in certain areas of the country. I would have gone a bit further with that. The supervisory function of the Fed is an important one for their consideration of monetary policy. But I wasn't necessarily convinced it was absolutely essential it all had to reside there. Now, a case has been made to me that, in fact, it is far more important than maybe I thought, but that was one area that I was willing to consider more work on. People have raised the issue of Fannie and Freddie with me. Why didn't we include this? In fact, if I heard the word Fannie and Freddie one more time, I was going to gag. Every time I turned around, it was, again, the mantra on the other side. And I think as Judd Gregg said it well on the floor debate, on the floor of the Senate, when he stood up and he made the point that no one really knew what they wanted to do. We know that we need a housing financing mechanism. We all, I think, understand that. And had you eliminated Fannie and Freddie altogether, the problem, I think, would have also been worse at the time. It's in conservatorship. It's being well managed today, and it's needed. But clearly, I agree totally that we need a different model for doing this. But you couldn't find any two people who would agree on what that ought to be. And so the idea we're going to hold up everything else until we resolve that, I think we'd been at a very different place in getting it. But I wish we had been able to do it. I still do. I think the new Congress has the obligation. In fact, we wrote into the bill, not that one Congress can bind the other constitutionally, but said this ought to be the work, the priority issue of the Congress coming in. And my hope is it would be. I think Barney has said he'd like it to be. Tim Johnson, I think, has a strong interest as well, so my hope is they'll move forward. I'll tell you one area that does need attention. And again, I'd hoped we might be able to do something. And again, I was reading Boyd and Gray the other day in an op-ed piece, and I think it was in the Washington Post, when he raised the constitutionality and of the too big to fail provisions. First of all, again, for the law school participants in the room today, I made sure we wrote a good severability clause into this bill, so that if they find one part wrong, we're not going to lose the whole bill in the process. Learned that lesson years ago as well. I think it's along the way. But putting that in, and frankly, believe me when I tell you, the lawyers that poured over and scoured over this, every section of the bill. In fact, the irony is, in some ways, it was my good friend Bob Corker who insisted upon this judicial involvement early on in the process of winding down. That he wanted to have that legal. The question that Boyd and Gray raises, those of you who read the article about this. Now, our lawyers and lawyers at Treasury poured over, we think it's constitutional. But I'll tell you one thing needs to be done, bankruptcy law. Again, the bankruptcy law clearly has to be modified because dealing with highly interconnected companies and a bankruptcy proceeding, I'm not sure our bankruptcy laws know how to accommodate that well. We can deal with bankruptcies of an individual company, but you have sound, well-running operations that could also be adversely affected in the wind-down proceedings of a bankruptcy. And therefore, you're going to need some reform of that. That should have been, my hope, was a part of the bill, but other matters overtook it. So those are 2 or 3 areas. What else? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator Dodd. My name is Parisa Mantegi. I'm a second-year law student here at GW Law School. Thank you not only for being here, but for your years of service to our country. Much appreciated. The question I have, and one of the observations I've had, not only from today, but in looking at the discourse of the causes of the financial crisis, even post-crisis and post-Dodd-Frank, that there seems to be, to me, still a lack of consensus as to what caused the collapse in the first place. And I wanted to get your sense if you believe that to be true, and some people continue to attribute it to whether it was housing or the 2 institutions you mentioned who should now be nameless, or whether it was these financial instruments or too big to fail, or excessive risk, excessive greed. to what extent do you think this lack of consensus had an impact on the effectiveness of the piece of legislation you drafted, and what effect it may have on the implementation on the legislation as well?
Well, there were those. It's a great question, and there were those who wanted us to wait and sort of do a Pecora commission. For those who followed the history as well, and Pecora was not a senator; he was the staff director of the committee. So that was one reason I didn't want a Pecora commission. This would be called the Pecora bill or something, or the Eddie Silverman bill, I guess it might have been called. It was my staff director along the way. But if we had done that, it seemed to me this would never have happened. I should have pointed out, by the way, and again in these remarks, there have been many people calling for reform of the financial services sector long before Bear Stearns and otherwise. This had been around. It just, there was never any energy for it. I mean, a lot of people, in fact, Hank Paulson wrote a long piece, or it was leaked. Someone who may know how that got out, but it got, when it got actually, he laid out some ideas on what reform ought to look like. Now, not that I welcomed, obviously, and any of us did, the crisis. But in the absence of this crisis, I wouldn't be standing here talking about financial reform, except in the abstract. It wouldn't have happened but had we had this situation. So if there's any silver lining in all of this, to the extent you think we've done more good than not with this bill, then it may have helped. But the problem also is again, people are sort of defending their political turf, in my view, in a way. And so if you suggest this was occurring because and there wasn't enough oversight occurring, there wasn't enough, the regulators had decided there was a deregulation environment that led to all of this, that's sort of an indictment in a way. I don't intend it to be, but I think that was a major, if I had to pick one area, I think that was the major area. And again, it was a matter of philosophy to some degree, that this was the right thing to do. The markets would take care of all of these things. Markets would make the corrections. That an overly aggressive regulatory sector was just going to strangle the inability to create new instruments, new ideas, new products, and so forth. It would create wealth and jobs and the like. And again, I make the case, I think there's a danger of that, of strangling the innovation and creativity. But I strongly make the case as well that if you don't have a regulatory system that can keep an eye on this, what you saw happen can happen, particularly in the global economy we're dealing in. We're no longer do actions in one place. For those of you who remember, there was an exchange in China, a Shanghai exchange, that represented about 5% of the volume of the New York Stock Exchange, going back now several years ago. And they collapsed one day, declined by about 12 or 14% one day. Within a matter of a day, that small collapse metastasized around the world. You know, end of debate about whether or not we're living in a global economy, where a relatively small exchange having some difficulties can spread very quickly. So the notion somehow of harmonization, of rules, of having some guidelines, not racing to the bottom, where you get people coming up and saying, you don't let me do what I want to do, I'm going to pack my bags and leave, that's got to stop, again. And otherwise, we're going to do great damage to ourselves. So, but I believe the basic problem has been, and clearly, look, there's no question that the housing financing system is a problem. It needed to be corrected. There's a debate about how that evolved. I don't disagree that that's certainly part of it. But I also happen to believe it was the securitization market, the failure to have underwriting standards, the idea that home values are always going to climb despite the fact that no one seemed to have a memory of what happened in the late 80s. You didn't have to go back to ancient history to know all of this. And so all of these factors, to one degree or another, contributed to it. But if I had to point to one, if you asked me to prioritize them, I would say it was starving institutions, denying them the appropriations to have staff and the like. One of the things we tried to cure in a lot of these areas where people would literally in an appropriation process, the Federal Trade Commission is a classic example of a federal agency that was starved to death in terms of functioning. The SEC, again, putting aside whatever else you may think and the Madoff problems and all else, they were being starved, not by accident. This wasn't just a mistake that happened. This was a conscious decision to do so. And I think that contributed to that environment. Yes, where are we? Over here. Yes, sir.
Hello. I'm also 2L here at GW. In my former life, I was actually an IT manager. And you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks that technologically a lot had changed. Mm-hmm. And actually, you just now touched on what my question was going to be, is technologically, to keep up, is extremely expensive. Yeah. And the institutions that are being regulated have the funds to keep up technologically. So what do you see in the bill or in the future that can be done to help our regulators stay up technologically, and especially now in the current Congress, whether or not there's even the funding opportunities to get that technological advancement?
Well, the technology stuff is a good question, and there are those who I'm sure have ideas on, but then you've raised a question that is worthy of a response in a related manner. And that is that I hope some of you in this room who are students are going to think about a career and a life in which you go to work for the regulatory bodies of this country is appealing to you. You know, I'm old enough to remember. I was a 14-year-old boy standing with my parents on the east side of the Capitol 50 years ago next week to watch a young president be sworn into office, and John Kennedy. And I joined the Peace Corps when I left college. I got so excited, as a generation of us did, because a lot of us were asked to be a part of something larger than ourselves. And today, still, there are people who will envy and compete to get a job in the Justice Department. There are people who want to go to the State Department and so forth. I don't hear many people necessarily scrapping to go to the SEC or the FDIC and others. I hope there are. For some reason, this has been considered, you know, not our best, or not our, want to make, maybe a stop there for a year or two to sort of then go to the door and spin it out someplace. To get good people, put aside technology aside for it, getting good people, competent people who understand this and want to be involved in it and can be healthy is so important, in my view. And we need to celebrate that, and we need to reward people for it, both in terms of how we treat them as well as financially reward them. Or you're going to end up, again, put all the technology you want in place. If you don't have talented, good, competent people who decide this is a career worth having, then I think our country suffers. And I think there has been too much of that, in my view, in the past. And so I'll take advantage of the question to urge those of you who are students here, either in the business school, the law school, and elsewhere, being involved in things larger than yourself. I can't begin to tell you the great joy that I've had serving, not as just a Peace Corps volunteer, where sort of the imagination got struck about being in a public life, and obviously elective office is different than others. But the great sense of being involved in some of these questions is so worthwhile. There's a great old Irish expression, you know, it says there's no luggage rack on a hearse, you know, and there's no trailer hitch, you know, and how many people do you meet in your life in the latter years when they look back and are asked the question, what did you do with your life? What did you do with your life? What difference did you make in your life? And I know damn few people who want to necessarily give someone a balance sheet to answer the question. We'd like to think we made a difference. We contributed in some way to make this a better country, a stronger world, a safer place. Not easy, but people can make a difference. And so, yes, we need to provide the resources to make sure the technology is there. But long before the technology, we made it damn sure that we attract good people, and that good people want to make a career out of this, of being in an area where we can make a huge difference for our country. So resource allocation obviously is important. Getting people who are involved in the industry to help. This isn't a question. We've got to get over this notion it's an antithetical, adversarial kind of relationship. When the crisis hit, and I won't get into the business of naming names, but I called some of the barons of the financial sector. And I said, why don't you come on down and take the 20 brightest people you've got, rent the top 2 floors in the Marriott Hotel not far from the Treasury Department, and offer to provide your services to the country for the next 6 months or a year, whatever it took, in order to get our nation back on its feet again. What a story that would have been. People stepping up who've done well financially off all of this, seen what's happened to the country. Not that they were necessarily responsible for what occurred, but take all of that talent and that ability, how smart and gifted they are, to come in and say, let's work together to get this right. Having a good regulatory structure is not antithetical to business interests. It's essential for them to get it right. And the industry itself has to communicate that idea. That doesn't mean you agree with everything. You ought to fight back on things that don't make sense, that are wrong, that are useless in many ways. But there is a rationale for having a good structure in place that allows us to become a vibrant, strong country that we absolutely must be, and the tools of the financial sector. One of the problems that I had as a member of Congress on this issue is financial literacy is not just a general problem with the public. It's a general problem with too many people, including my colleagues on the subject matter. It's not well understood. As I say, everyone thinks, as in Congress, they ought to be Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or President, for that matter. But damn few ever think they could be Secretary of the Treasury or serve on the Federal Reserve Board. I was saying this at lunch. And so too often in the Banking Committee, when you come off the Banking Committee, your colleagues, when a bill was on the floor of the Senate, the question would be, not explain to me the derivatives section or how does proprietary trading work or how are we going to deal with the credit default. The question is it okay? Is it okay? That's how I mean. And that was basically the only question you'd get. And so get a bill like this together where, again, you had a lot of people bellowing and screaming and quoting others on the thing, was hard to get this right. So educating people about this is critically important as well. Anyway, that's a very long answer to a technical question, but since you asked the question, I couldn't resist the idea that I hope many of you in this room who are students will seriously consider committing yourself to this life. You will have more fun. You will make such a difference by doing so that I would urge you to give it serious consideration as well. What else? Anything else at all at the time? Our time. I'm running on at the mouth
Not
here.
so much
Apologize.
that, Senator, but in my capacity as an educator, I want you to end on that wonderful call to action.
All right. Call to action.
Pay attention.
Thank you all very much. Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.